Let's take a minute to talk about class and style bindings with Vue.js. Here in my HTML, I've got 3 divs, each with a static class of box. And if we take a quick look at my CSS, you can see box just gives these divs a background color, height, and a little margin. We've also got these 2 classes, active and new class, which are not currently applied to any element in my HTML. Here in my Vue instance, I've got an active class property, which has a value of active, an active styles property, which contains an object with height and border CSS properties essentially, and this is active property set to a value of true. Well, we're going to use vbind to bind certain classes and styles to some of these divs, theoretically based on conditions on our page, either buttons that a user has pressed or pages that a user has navigated to. Any number of things can change the values of these properties or update the values of these properties and reflect the changes in the state of your application based on how a user is interacting with it. So let's just try a pretty simple example. I'm going to take this first div and I'm going to use the vbind directive to bind the class attribute to the value of active class. Quick note, it is completely okay to have both a static vanilla HTML attribute class and a view-bound class attribute. Both of these at the same time on the same element is completely okay. There is no problem with that. Okay, I can do both. So I'm going to save. I'm going to reload. And now our first div has a green border because the class of active, which is the value of active class, has now been applied to that element. Okay? Now there is a more efficient way of doing this. If you have both a static class that never changes, this class of box is theoretically never going to change on this div, and a more dynamic class, you can and probably should just include them both in the same vbind class attribute here. And the way you would do that is by using array syntax. Just like that. So we have the value of active class as one item in this array of classes, and box as a string. That's important. If this is just the name of a class, whether it was new class or active, if it is simply the name of a class, that must be a string. We have the value of this variable, this property, and the string box, both bound to this div. Now this string box is never going to change, ever. I mean, you could force it to change if you wanted to, but it is not going to change as a result of user interaction or changes in the Vue instance, but this active class might. Okay, so I'm going to save, reload, and no change. There's no more class of box. Now it's included in this view-bound list of classes. Okay, so to bind multiple classes at the same time, we use array syntax. Class names need to be strings. And variables, this needs to contain a string. If this contained a number or something else, this might throw an error. All right, so that's binding classes. Now let's take a quick look at binding styles. Here under active styles, I've actually got an object with 2 readable CSS properties and values. So on this second div, underneath class, I'm going to do the vbind directive, and this time I'm going to bind the style attribute. And I'm simply going to feed in active styles, the property. This property or variable which contains this object. Okay. Binding the style property, it expects to receive an object. It's as simple as that. Even if you only have one property, it expects to receive an object. So if I only had height, the syntax it would expect would be this: height 250 pixels. Okay? Just like that. Save, reload, and there we go. Div number 2 is now twice as tall, or taller, not twice as tall, and it has an inset teal border. And those are coming from these properties here in the active styles property in my data object. Okay. Now, if I wanted to add something, another one like background color here. This hyphen is actually going to confuse the engine. So I have two options here for how to proceed. The first one is to encase this whole key, this property name, in quotes and make it a string. And that will work. That's completely fine. But if I, for whatever reason, don't want to do that, I can simply remove the hyphen and replace it with camel case. This goes for any hyphenated CSS property: background color, background image, mixed blend mode, border radius. Actually, that's a good one. So border radius would look like this. Okay? But if I do that, save, reload, there we go. We've added an additional style property that is being dynamically included in the style attribute of this div. And I might have a function somewhere that changes the properties that this active styles includes, that this active styles object includes, or changes the value of these. It might change to 50 pixels or something like that. So that's another way of managing the styling of your elements using the Vue instance. But where this all comes together is in state management. State management. I've thrown that term around a lot, a couple times at least. But that's where the Vue instance really shines. And we're going to see more of that next week. But in using Vue or similar frameworks, you're often going to see state-dependent properties like is active or is running, is started, game is running. User is logged in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these are going to have values of true or false. And these collectively determine the state of your application. So this would be a property that determines whether or not something is active. Makes sense? And what we can do is bind a class or a set of styles conditionally. So we can make sure that a class or set of styles or multiple classes only apply to an element if is active is true. Okay? So it's just the same logic as VIF or as any other if statement, but using Vue-specific syntax. So to do something like that, we would need vbind once again. Let's do class this time. And what we're going to do is bind, this is going to be an object as well, the value of active class if is active, is true. And that's what that looks like. This is not well, I guess technically it is a key value pair. The key, the property, is active class, which is going to be the string active, the class name, and only if is active is true will it actually apply. So currently is active is true. We should see the class of active applied to this third box. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't do it this way. This needs to actually be the class name. There we go. So there's active, or we could use that new class, which we haven't seen before. Okay, So new class will be applied as long as isActive is true. So if I change isActive to false, it goes back to normal. Let's use this array syntax to bind multiple classes at the same time with a conditional class. Okay, so outside of this object, I'm going to wrap the whole thing in square brackets for that array syntax. And after this object, I'm going to do comma, box. Okay, no changes, but if I change isActive back to true, there we go. Box is still an active class. We know that because if it weren't, this div would have no height, no width, well, no set width, and no margin. Box is still active, and we have a conditional class which will only apply if a certain property in our Vue instance is true, if a certain condition has been met. Okay, so that is class and styling, class and style binding at a very fundamental level. Feel free to play around with this, try some new classes of your own, try combining these with some of the directives we've already learned, and we'll have a more complex example coming up.